The shrill screech of metal on metal jerked Jake awake. His heart skipped a beat as he rushed to the window. His backyard, the one place he cherished, was completely transformed. White chairs lined up in rows, flowers everywhere, and workers scurrying around like it was a movie set.
What is going on?
But it was real. And there she was, Karen. Standing
All right,
like she
people,
owned the place,
let's get
barking
this
orders
done.
to the crew.
Move those chairs.
Karen, what the hell is going on? Jake's
Make
voice
sure these
cut through the
chairs are
chaos.
perfectly aligned.
She turned, flashing that smug smile. Oh, Jake, you're finally up. It's my daughter's wedding. Didn't you get the notice?
You can't
Jake's
do this,
fists
Karen.
clenched.
Watch
This
me.
wasn't just a wedding. This was war. Karen turned to face him, her smug smile widening as she stepped further into the center of his yard. She wore her usual oversized sunglasses, even though the sun wasn't out, and her expensive tailored dress screamed control, just like she always did. Jake's blood boiled as she casually waved her hand toward the setup, clearly enjoying the spectacle of it all. "Oh, Jake, you really should be more considerate," she said, her tone sweet but dripping with condescension. "This is an important day for my daughter. It's not every day a wedding like this happens in the neighborhood." Jake clenched his fists. "This is my property. You didn't ask for permission." Karen barely acknowledged his outburst. "We don't need permission. The HOA rules are clear. You should feel honored. We decided your yard was perfect for today's event." Jake's stomach churned as he looked around at the chaos unfolding in his once peaceful space, caterers unloading food, DJs setting up near his fence, and his koi pond now surrounded by giggling bridesmaids. "I don't care about your rules," Jake snapped. "Get this crap out of my yard, Karen." She just laughed, her voice saccharine sweet. "Oh, Jake, don't make this harder than it has to be. You wouldn't want to be the only one in the neighborhood who ruins my daughter's special day, would you?" Jake's blood ran cold. She was using his own neighborhood against him, and he knew he had to fight back fast. Jake stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. Karen had turned his backyard into a circus, and she wasn't backing down. As he glanced around at the workers, it was clear that this wasn't just a small, impulsive event, it was an orchestrated invasion. A few days ago, he had received a notice about community events from the HOA. It seemed harmless at first, another one of Karen's small attempts at control. He had tossed it aside, never imagining it would lead to this. "You've really outdone yourself, Karen," Jake muttered under his breath as he stepped back into his house to grab his phone. He needed to know exactly what Karen was trying to pull. There had to be some way to stop this. But the anger was building, seeping into every thought. He couldn't believe she had done this, had just decided to hijack his property, all without a single conversation. He dialed Tom, the one neighbor who didn't buy into Karen's crap. "Hey, Tom," Jake said, his voice tight. "Do you know anything about this wedding in my yard?" Tom hesitated. "Yeah, I heard about it. Karen's made some new rule about community events. But don't stress, man. It's all a ploy. She's twisted the HOA rules to her advantage again. Just watch your back." Jake rubbed his temples. He knew what Tom meant. Karen and her crew were always bending the rules, but this was different. The more he thought about it, the more it sank in. This wasn't just about a wedding. It was about control, and Karen was using his property as a pawn in her game. A few hours later, the event began to take shape. The DJ's speakers blared, and the caterers brought in trays of food, blocking Jake's driveway in the process. He tried to make his way outside, but a crew member, one of Karen's loyal followers, stood in his way, as if Jake were the one in the wrong. "Excuse me," Jake said, his voice strained with frustration. "Can you move your truck? I need to get out of here." The man just stared at him blankly. "Sorry, buddy. The wedding's in progress. You'll have to wait." Jake's eyes narrowed. This was the final straw. He'd had enough of Karen's petty games. The workers weren't even pretending to respect his space anymore. They had completely overrun his yard, and now they were blocking his path without a care. "Are you serious? This is my driveway," Jake shouted, but the man didn't budge. He stormed back inside, slamming the door behind him. Karen was making it clear this wasn't just a violation of his property. It was an all-out declaration of dominance. But Jake wasn't going to let her win this time. He could already feel his blood boiling. The wedding was happening in full swing by late afternoon. Jake stood by his window, watching helplessly as the event unfolded on his property. The smell of food filled the air, the sound of laughter, and music buzzing around his yard. But then he saw something that made his stomach churn. Bridesmaids running through his flower beds, their heels digging into the carefully tended plants, trampling over the delicate petals. Jake's frustration hit a boiling point. He needed to do something, but he couldn't just let his property be destroyed without a fight. As he paced around the house, the absurdity of the situation hit him even harder. Not only had Karen taken over his yard without permission, but now his once beautiful garden, his sanctuary, was being destroyed in front of him like it didn't even matter. It wasn't just the flowers, It was the koi pond, the benches, the stone paths he'd meticulously designed. This was his space, and Karen was turning it into a circus. His fists clenched as he gritted his teeth. He couldn't stand it anymore. That's when he noticed it. One of the bridesmaids was laughing as she held a glass of champagne over the side of his koi pond, spilling the liquid into the water. Jake's heart sank. This wasn't just an event. It was a slow, methodical ruin of everything he'd worked so hard to maintain. He slammed his hand against the window. Something had to change. It wasn't long before Jake heard the unmistakable sound of sirens. A few squad cars rolled up to the curb and Jake's pulse quickened. Was Karen finally overstepping the line? Had someone called the cops about the wedding? Sure enough, one of the officers came over to Jake's door, knocking loudly. "Hey, are you the homeowner?" Jake stepped outside, heart racing. "Yeah, that's me." "What's going on? We've had a few complaints," the officer said, eyeing the scene in Jake's yard. "There's an unauthorized event happening on private property, and it looks like the wedding organizers don't have the proper permits. We're here to investigate." Jake clenched his jaw. Karen had clearly manipulated the HOA rules to get everything in place, but now the authorities were involved. This could be the opening he needed. They don't have permission. "This whole thing's a mess," Jake said, pointing to the workers and vendors. "You need to shut this down." The officer nodded. "We're going to look into this. If it's not properly permitted, the event has to end." Karen from across the yard saw the cops and immediately rushed toward them, her face contorting into a mask of feigned confusion. "What's going on here?" she asked, trying to play the victim. One officer stepped toward her stern. "We've received reports of an unauthorized event. We need to speak to you." Jake watched with growing satisfaction. The first cracks in Karen's empire were beginning to show, but this was only the beginning. The authorities weren't the real threat Jake's plan was, and soon enough, Karen would feel the full force of his revenge. As Jake stood on his porch watching the cops interact with Karen, the realization hit him. He had the upper hand now. Karen had crossed the line by using his property for her own selfish needs, and she was going to pay for it. He had been pushed to his breaking point, but there was one thing Karen didn't know. Jake wasn't just going to fight her through the HOA. No, he had a much better plan. The sprinkler system. The old, rusted underground pipes he had never used, the ones filled with disgusting, murky water. And when the time was right, he would make sure this wedding turned into the disaster of the century. Jake wasn't just going to take his yard back, he was going to ruin her special day, and Karen wouldn't know what hit her. The DJ's music shifted to a slow, romantic melody, and the guests began to murmur in anticipation. The bride was about to make her grand entrance, and everything seemed to be going perfectly until it wasn't. Jake leaned against the railing of his back porch, his eyes locked on Karen, who stood near the front surveying the scene with that same arrogant, smug smile. She had completely forgotten about him. She was convinced that she had won, that she had everyone wrapped around her finger. "Here we go," Jake muttered under his breath, his fingers hovering over the sprinkler controls in the garage. Karen stood beaming, nodding at the crowd. She waved at her daughter, who was about to step into the yard for the grand moment. Guests stood cameras at the ready, and Jake saw her, Stephanie the bride. Her smile faltered the moment she stepped onto the grass. The flower girls scattered in front of her, running wild through the chaos, but that wasn't the worst of it. Jake could see it. He could feel the anticipation building as he checked the time. It was now or never. As the first notes of the song filled the air, the bridesmaids lined up, stepping carefully to avoid the muddy patches that had appeared near the front. The guests seemed oblivious to the chaos behind them, but then Jake flicked the switch. It started as a gurgle, soft, almost imperceptible. No one noticed at first. But then the ground trembled. The sprinklers came to life, spewing thick, rusty water in every direction. The first row of guests screamed, scrambling to get out of the way, as the foul-smelling water drenched their clothes, ruining their expensive outfits. The water splashed onto the tables, soaking the pristine white tablecloths, and worse, splattered all over the wedding cake, turning it into a soggy mess of ruined sugar and despair. The DJ's equipment sparked, the speakers crackled before they fell silent, drenched. The guests staggered back, some slipping in the mud, others shrieking in surprise. The entire wedding turned into a chaotic swamp as the guests tried to flee from the rising flood. And then it happened. The bride stepped forward, ready for her moment in the spotlight. But instead of a grand entrance, she was met with the grotesque sight of her white gown splashing directly into a puddle of brown, rust-colored water. Her eyes went wide, her scream piercing the air as she tried to lift the hem of her dress. But it was too late. Her beautiful gown, once a symbol of her perfect day, was ruined beyond repair. Karen, who had been standing at the front, grinning like a proud mother, froze in horror. Her smile vanished, replaced by an expression of sheer panic. She spun toward Jake's house, eyes wild with disbelief. Jake stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching her like a hawk. "Oh, Karen," he said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "You really should have picked a real venue." Her gaze locked on to him, filled with fury. She stomped toward his house, slipping on the wet grass, her heels sinking into the mud. "You did this?" she screamed, her voice cracking with rage. Jake simply shrugged. "Seems like a plumbing issue. Should have done your homework before turning my yard into your personal wedding venue." But Karen wasn't listening anymore. She was beyond furious, her hands shaking as she tried to salvage whatever she could of the event. The crowd was turning, the whispers spreading, and the phones were out. Guests were filming the disaster unfold. "Mom, what's going on?" Stephanie asked, her voice trembling. She stood frozen, the ruin of her wedding dress soaking through her face now contorted in confusion and anger. Karen opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her once steady grip on the situation had slipped away. I... Jake stepped forward, his voice calm but cutting. "You didn't tell them, did you? You didn't tell them that this wasn't a real venue? That you didn't even bother to book one because you blew the HOA's event fund on yourself?" The crowd gasped. Guests began to murmur louder, pulling out their phones. Some had already started recording. Stephanie's face drained of color as the truth hit her. "You lied to me. You didn't book a venue. You used someone's private property without asking." David the groom walked up to Stephanie, his face drawn in disbelief. "I had no idea. This is insane, Stephanie. I thought we were doing things properly, but your mom, she's been controlling everything." Stephanie turned away from him, her hands shaking. "I had no idea. I swear." Her voice cracked. David sighed, stepping back. "This isn't just a wedding disaster, Stephanie. This is a preview of what life with her would be like. I can't do this anymore." The guests watched in stunned silence. David's words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Then slowly he turned and walked away, leaving the bride standing alone in the mess that was once her wedding day. The crowd began to disperse, the whispers growing louder as people started to leave disgusted by the spectacle. Karen, now frantic, turned to her guests, trying to salvage whatever dignity she had left. "We can move the wedding inside. We can fix this." Jake's lips curled into a smug smile. "Inside? You mean into my house? Get off my property, Karen, before I call the cops." Her face twisted in rage, but she had no choice. She turned, her shoulders slumped, as the last of her guests left muttering amongst themselves about the disaster. And then the sirens came. The first police car arrived just as the last guests were trickling out. The officers approached, and Jake could see Karen's face turn from fury to panic. She was trapped. She had nowhere to hide now. The damage was done, and the truth about her misuse of HOA funds was exposed for all to see. Jake leaned back against his porch railing, watching as Karen was questioned by the police. Her face twisted with desperation, but it was too late. Her empire had crumbled. Jake sat back on his porch watching as the last few cars pulled away from his driveway. His yard, once a pristine oasis, was now a battlefield of mud, broken decorations, and ruined dreams. The wedding was over. The chaos had subsided, but the mess remained, a permanent reminder of what had just unfolded. Across the street, Karen's house was eerily quiet. The curtains were drawn, and her front yard, normally pristine and overgroomed, was now a mess of discarded flyers and half-filled flower pots. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable fallout. Tom, the one neighbor who had always been on Jake's side, walked across the street and joined him on the porch. "Well, that was something," he said, shaking his head still in disbelief. Jake chuckled, taking a sip of his coffee. "Yeah, I think we've just made neighborhood history." Tom leaned against the railing, glancing at Karen's empty yard. "I don't think anyone's going to be siding with her anytime soon. After all that, people are already talking. They're ready to vote her out of the HOA board." Jake nodded slowly. "She's done. After everything she pulled, no one's going to stand by her now." It was a relief. For years, Karen had controlled the HOA, using it like her own personal tool to make everyone in the neighborhood bend to her will. But now the whole thing was falling apart. And for the first time in a long time, Jake could breathe easy. The police had taken care of the immediate mess. There were rumors already swirling about a full investigation into Karen's misuse of the HOA funds, the very funds she had spent on herself instead of using them for the community. It was only a matter of time before the authorities would take more action. The whole neighborhood was buzzing, but not about the wedding. No one cared anymore about the ruined dress or the flooded lawn. They were all talking about Karen's downfall, and it was clear she had lost her grip on the HOA. A few days later, the neighborhood was still reeling from the wedding disaster. But for Jake, the sense of satisfaction only grew as the days passed. He had gotten back more than just his yard. He had reclaimed his freedom. Tom had been right. The HOA board had already begun distancing themselves from Karen. There were calls for an emergency meeting to discuss her potential removal from the board. Rumors about a full audit of the HOA funds were already circulating. With Karen's corruption now exposed, it was clear that she was going to have to answer for her actions. Jake chuckled as he walked by a neighbor's yard and overheard them talking. "Did you hear? They're going to audit the HOA funds. Karen might be facing charges." It was like a wave of relief washing over him. For years, the HOA had been a tool for Karen's petty control, and now it was all unraveling. A few days later, he received a call from the local authorities. Karen was officially under investigation for fraud, and the HOA's board was being restructured. There were whispers about possible legal action against her for misappropriating funds. Jake couldn't help but smile as he hung up the phone. This was exactly what she deserved. She had gone too far, and now her empire was crumbling. As Jake walked out to his yard one final time, the sight of his yard, though still a little worse for wear, filled him with a sense of peace. His koi pond, though slightly muddied, still held a sense of calm. The flowers would grow back, the lawn would heal, and soon everything would be back to normal. But the difference now was that Karen's reign over the neighborhood was over. Across the street, Karen's house sat in silence. The lights were off, and the car in her driveway hadn't moved in days. It was clear that she was gone. Whether she had left town to escape the mounting legal pressure or simply packed up her things to flee the scandal, Jake couldn't say. But it didn't matter anymore. Karen had lost everything, her control, her reputation, and her power over the neighborhood. Jake stood at the fence, his eyes scanning the quiet street, and he smiled to himself. The community was finally free of her tyranny. They no longer had to live in fear of her fines or her manipulation. As he turned back toward his house, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Tom. HOA meeting tomorrow. Final vote on whether to disband the whole thing. Bring popcorn. Jake laughed aloud, shaking his head. "I'll be there." For the first time in years, he felt like he could finally relax. No more threats, no more petty rules, and definitely no more Karen. Jake leaned back on his porch, the setting sun casting a golden glow over the quiet neighborhood. It had been a long road, but in the end, he had won. The battle for his yard and for his peace of mind was finally over, and Jake couldn't have been happier. The phone buzzed again. It was Tom. "One last message. Guess Karen's not coming to the meeting. She's selling the house." Jake smiled. Good riddance. As the last of the sunlight faded behind the trees, Jake settled back into his chair. Finally, there was peace. And for the first time in a long time, Jake could enjoy the quiet knowing that Karen's reign of terror had come to an end.